Long before the Civil War and the 14th Amendment, there were free blacks who lived, thrived, and contributed significantly to the early history of the United States. Of course, it wasn't easy being a free black person in the American colonies. They faced numerous obstacles based merely on the color of their skin. But many were able to live good, even remarkable lives that deserve to be remembered. The population of free blacks in the colonies was never especially large, making up around 2% of the American population in the mid-18th century, and as much as 9% of the total black population in the country. That small percentage could grow much larger in some communities, especially in the South. During the 18th century, half of the population of Williamsburg, Virginia was black, mostly enslaved. The free black population of Virginia was centered mostly around Williamsburg, but numbered as few as 2,000 people by 1782. Most of them were mixed race. At least 80% of the free blacks in Maryland were, for instance. This was partially thanks to laws passed in colonial Virginia which controlled what status those born in the state would hold. In 1662, the Virginia Assembly incorporated an older legal doctrine known as partus sequitur ventrum, literally translated as that which is born follows the womb. This was in direct response to some legal cases which questioned the status of children born to English men and enslaved women, as well as children born to free women. According to the Assembly, doubts have arisen whether children got by an Englishman upon a black woman should be slave or free. The rule meant that children born to enslaved women by European fathers, often their masters, were enslaved from birth. But it also meant the opposite, that children born to free women were free, regardless of the status of their fathers. This was a much less common situation, but it wasn't impossible or unheard of. In fact, most of the free African Americans in Virginia and Maryland were not descended from white fathers, but white mothers. Servant women who had children by slaves are free African Americans. Most other colonies followed Virginia in incorporating partus sequitur ventrum, providing for a time the only way black or mixed-race children could be born free in the colonies. But that 1662 law also imposed fines on any Christian who would commit fornication with a black person. In the 1600s, these free blacks had largely the same rights as whites. At the turn of the 18th century, however, saw laws surrounding the rights of blacks, both free and enslaved, change. In 1676, Nathaniel Bacon led Bacon's Rebellion, which saw a number of members of the lower classes, such as women, both black and white indentured servants, and both enslaved and free blacks, join together against the Virginia governor. Though Bacon's interests may not have aligned completely with those of the lower classes he led, the potential for a mixed-race rebellion frightened many of the wealthy landowners of Virginia, and would be part of the inspiration for Virginia's slave codes, enacted in 1705. The codes, among other things, barred enslaved and free blacks from owning weapons, and blacks from employing whites. It served to segregate blacks and whites, in the hopes that it would prevent a rebellion like Bacon's. More laws followed, including in 1723 a law that severely limited slave owners' ability to manumit their slaves, requiring any manumission to be approved by the governor and his general council. This kept the population of free blacks from increasing much over the next 50 years. In the face of serious discrimination and legal obstacles, nonetheless, numerous free blacks were able to live decent lives. Today, longtime interpreter Emily James portrays a woman named Edith Cumbo at colonial Williamsburg. Records about Cumbo are sparse, but her story illuminates what it took to be a free woman of color in the years before, during, and after the American Revolution. Cumbo was born around 1735 to Richard Cumbo, a free black man, and a free white woman, which made her free according to Virginia law. She was probably born in Charles City County, across the river from the town of Williamsburg. Though the records are scarce, she seems to have descended from Emmanuel Cambo, a black man granted a patent for 50 acres in James City County, Virginia, in 1667. The Cumbo family was active in the Virginia region, owning some significant pieces of land within the colony. According to Emily James, Edith's father was granted land in Williamsburg for service during the French and Indian War. Edith inherited the land when her father died, as well as a pair of horses and an indentured servant. Sometime in the 1750s, she had her son, Daniel. Despite having a child, Edith never married, likely because 18th century law would make her property legally controlled by her husband. Edith was brought to court for having a child out of wedlock in August of 1769 in Halifax County. However, according to the transcript, she was found not guilty for reasons appearing to this court. What those reasons were is uncertain, but might have been because the father was someone prominent. Around the time of the Revolution, she moved to Williamsburg, and much of her family, including her parents, lived nearby. Cumbo probably made her money from her own skills, since her opportunities were circumscribed by her position. She seems to have run a fairly successful business as a laundress and seamstress and was one of the only 11 to 20 free blacks who lived in Williamsburg. In 1782, she was listed as the head of her own household. In 1778, she went to court again in a powerful way. She sued a white man, Adam White, for trespass, assault, and battery. Shocking for a time in which people of color often could not even testify against whites, Cumbo didn't just argue her case, but won in court. She was awarded 1 shilling. During the Revolution, her brothers and her son all appear to have fought with the American forces in the war. Unfortunately, Daniel died during the war, and so she was unable to pass her land and wealth on to another generation. In fact, hundreds of free and enslaved blacks fought in the Revolutionary War on both sides. The British promised freedom to slaves who escaped from their patriot owners to fight for the British, while numerous free blacks fought for the Americans, perhaps because of the powerful promise of the Declaration of Independence that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The promise of the Revolution was not entirely without benefit for enslaved Americans. After the war, manumissions were more common, and the population of free blacks in the new United States grew quickly before 1810, when 13% of blacks in the United States were free. That position was, however, precarious, and a woman like Edith Cumbo faced the constant threat of being deprived of her freedom, either by committing a crime and being forced into slavery, or by more nefarious means, including outright kidnapping. Emily James, her interpreter in modern colonial Williamsburg, said, "Edith was a woman to be reckoned with." And she had to be, as she would have had to be her own guard to protect her freedom every day. Though she had little education, one of the earliest black schoolhouses still stands in Williamsburg but didn't take students until 1760, she was likely at least semi-literate, could read the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer, and she likely attended church weekly, as was legally required. It isn't clear if she ever attended his services, but she certainly would have been aware of another Williamsburg resident who had a significant impact. Preacher Gowan Pamphlet. Pamphlet was an enslaved man born around 1748, though it isn't clear where or who his parents were. Sometime before 1779, he became the property of Jane Voby, who owned the King's Arm Tavern in Williamsburg. Gowan probably learned to read the Bible and took part in Christian services at the Bruton Parish Church, part of the official colonial church, the Church of England. Pamphlet seemed to have begun preaching around the time of the American Revolution, inspired in part by an itinerant black preacher named Moses. Though the Church of England was the official church of Virginia, there were a number of other Protestant churches that taught an evangelical message of equality before God, such as the Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians. Those churches, especially the Baptists, also tended to be less strict in how they worshipped at church, or as Emily James said in character as Edith, they allowed you to express yourself. Moses had been forced out of Williamsburg for his preaching, but Pamphlet stepped in. It was illegal for people of color to gather in large groups, and oral history suggests that Pamphlet's early sermons were given in nature at a plantation several miles from town. Pamphlet was popular among the enslaved, and his popularity probably inspired attacks on his character. A regional Baptist organization even temporarily kicked him out of the Baptist fold, deciding that no person of color should be allowed to preach. That hardly stopped Pamphlet, and by 1781 he had a congregation of 200 people. By 1791, he had a congregation of as many as 500 and applied for membership in the Dover Baptist Association. There was a 2-year inspection period for new churches, but in August of 1793 he was imperiled when a man claimed that the black preacher Gowan dropped a letter in Yorktown that implicated him as a messenger in a network of armed slaves. He was forced to hide for several weeks, but the following month a deed was written up that would set Pamphlet free. That was likely when he chose his surname. A month after that, the Baptist Church of Black People at Williamsburg was admitted to the association. The church he founded continues to this day as the First Baptist Church in Williamsburg. That same year, Pamphlet was freed by Jane Voby's son. Pamphlet died sometime in 1806 or 1807, but he certainly left his church with solid foundations. Edith Cumbo's fate is uncertain. It's not known where or when she died. Both of them serve as examples of the ways that people of color contributed to the society of revolutionary America, despite the rules that bound them and the risks that they faced merely for being outspoken in a slave society. They used the courts, they used religion, they used their skills and their smarts and their steadfast courage to build lives for themselves and their families, and they fought for the promise of a new nation that wouldn't abolish slavery until decades after their deaths. They are wholly deserving of the title that's been conferred upon them by colonial Williamsburg, nation builders. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.